And it'll probably be on your test, you know, period docs are, right? So when you think about America, a lot of times American historians in the past would focus on somebody like Andrew Jackson, you know. But modern historians of the last 30 years have tried to figure out more what life was like for ordinary Americans, you know, like normal people, so to speak. And here he writes about this evolution of what is Jacksonian democracy. I mean, he doesn't call it that. He doesn't use that language here. We experienced a transformation in how we perceived ourselves and the world. We were growing dramatically. We've already covered this in the population growth rate. People were movement, you know, lots of westward expansion, particularly once Louisiana Purchase, things like that. Buying and selling, not only with the rest of the world, but increasingly with one another. This is what is sometimes called, as Matt Damon referenced in that film clip, the market revolution. Okay, and so it's the emergence of this market that puts a lot more Americans in contact with each other. Demographic, I want you to learn that term, that word, demographic. It's the study of populations and groups. So the study of groups, basically. So America's demographic, its population study, right, and commercial changes cannot help but affect every aspect. The world of the founding fathers, aristocratic, right? You know, the sort of manor-born lords, although they weren't lords. You know, they were people whose, well, it was inherited wealth. You know, if you think about Thomas Jefferson, his father was wealthy. Washington's father was wealthy. The essentially aristocratic world of the founding fathers was replaced by a democratic world. Now, I'm not going to say it's like today. I mean, when you look at the vote last week, that's an extraordinary outpouring of the American populace, right? You know, and that's cool. That's wonderful, particularly in this epidemic. But largely replaced by democracy under the banner of political parties. So I want to emphasize this again, because what I haven't really been talking much about is partisanship. You guys remember that term, to kind of like side with your party? So it's during this period that in many ways the prism in which you look through America was through a political party. It's very similar to that now for a whole lot of Americans. About, I would say, a good 70% of the American public today filter their governmental and political information through a partisan approach. You know, they think one side is right, the other side is wrong, so that's going to, you know, affect everything they look at. But that's something the founders, while they were aware that factions, as Madison called them, in Federalist 10, he says factions are going to occur in a democratic society, in a society where people get to vote. But he believed that they would be temporary. He writes that in, you know, in other words, you would form a group over some issue, and then once you resolve that issue, you would no longer be in that group. So what Madison did not predict, even though he helped create, was the modern two-party system. But that's what emerges, a sort of stable, you know, balance of power, separation of power system. So if you think about checks and balances, that's not in the Constitution of a two-party system. But, you know, people are looking at the election say, you know, in spite of the outcome, you know, in spite of Joe Biden's victory, the Senate is pretty clearly going to remain Republican. At least it seems to be at this moment, I expect it will. That means that President-elect Biden will have a divided government. And so we watch America routinely. I'll take you back to 2016. In 2016, when President Trump won the election, he had Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, which meant the Republicans could advance whatever basic agenda he wanted. They were holding Supreme Court case hearings today over the future of Obamacare. And Chief Justice Roberts spoke to the government and said, well, if y'all wanted to gotten rid of it, why didn't you get rid of it in 2017 when you lowered the penalty to 0? Why not just eliminate it? You know, does that make a deal to you? You know, like unconstitutionally. So the point of it being that by 2018, the Dems had retaken control of the House. And that meant President Trump had divided government. Okay, if you go back to 8 years prior to that, when President Obama got elected, you know, if you go back and you remember 08, you know, he would say arguably had a mandate, but he also had a Democratic House and Democratic Senate. Well, that's when the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was passed. 2 years later, the Senate went Republican. Excuse me, the House went Republican, and then the Senate went Republican. So he only had 2 years basically to govern. So what do we see in America with a two-party system? What do they do to each other?
They get absolutely nothing.
Well, that's kind of what it was designed. They check and balance each other. And so if they get something done, it means they have to do what word? Compromise. Like Henry Clay word, right? Compromise. And today, because of the strong and just animated feelings of the sort of base of the two parties, which are so far apart, that you don't find compromise much. But the founders didn't expect there to be a whole lot of government. Remember, they created a strong centralized government, but they didn't intend it to do a whole lot. That's why it takes so long to get laws passed and things like that. So what Madison sort of unintentionally helps create is the two-party system is a form of our system. It's a form of checks and balances. And so we don't have single-party majorities, rarely in this country's history. Arrogant feelings notwithstanding. So that meant that also an attitude was that if everybody's vote, keep in mind, I don't want to oversell this statement, because again, this was not an equality period. It was an equality period for who? For ordinary white guys, the common man, so to speak. It's hard to always give disclaimers every time I say that, but it is fair that, keep in mind, half of the entire human population of America, females, had no representation. Another seventh or so, particularly the sixth of the South, had no representation, African Americans. So it wasn't pure democracy. I don't want to get that far ahead of yourself. But we don't get to the next phase of history. We don't get a 15th Amendment. We don't get a 19th Amendment. If we don't have ordinary white guys voting. That's kind of like the first stepping stone. And that's where they really begin. And by the way, Jackson himself didn't really care much for George Washington. Jackson was a young congressman from Tennessee when President Washington was in office. He thought he put on airs and acted too fussy. So this is a period of I don't want to call it like the redneck ascendant, but think of it as frontiers guys. These are sort of rough-hewn country boys. These are the Hank Williams Jr. crowd, so to speak. So that's who America was on the frontier. And when we talk about rural versus urban, you think about that. You think about who America is around here to us versus who it is, say, to somebody who's living in Boston. And it's this large scale America that creates this long-standing tension. But parties have helped to do this. And whenever a third party arises, by the way, you know what happens? The two parties take a look at what they're doing and either absorb it or just literally add the party to themselves. In other words, there'll be a party that hates immigration, it's opposed to immigrants for its economic competition. And they're called the Know-Nothing Party, they're secretive, or the American Party. And the Republican Party will end up absorbing them. Now, President Lincoln won't be a nativist. He won't be like that. But the party will take into its identity part of that. And it's still with the party to some degree. And you have leaders who buck the party strings from time to time or redesign the party, like FDR, all right? But by and large, the parties remain. So this is a stable two-party system that was a result of coming out of what party? What singular party? Well, no, not for this party. No, they weren't federal. there were a handful of people who had been Federalists. They're called National Democratic Republicans. That's why it's complicated, because it's got Democratic in it, Democrat, and Republican, right? So what happens is when this election occurs, the Democratic Republicans split, and one becomes known as the Democrats, right? And that'll be Jackson's party. I want to make sure you understand that. So throughout this period, this two-party, and the other party will briefly be called the National Republicans. But by the end of Jackson's second term, they're going to be known as the Whig Party. So the only party you're not really familiar with in American history probably are the Whigs. And the Whigs are the other major party in American history. I don't usually list the Federalists as a major party because they were a continuation of what the Constitutional Convention was. And they lasted for how many presidencies? 2, as far as electorally. Now, of course, they ran people for that until the end of the election of 1820. Okay, after 1824, they're not a thing anymore, but their attitudes are still a part of this National Republican Party. I know it gets confusing. So we talked about Webster Hayne. The Webster Hayne, and you can pretty much understand that Hayne is speaking for John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun is vice president, so he can't be up there poo-pooing the national. I mean, it's very similar to what Jefferson did when he was vice president. The Kentucky resolution, right? So he can't oppose this tariff famously, because he's supposed to be part of the administration. Now he'll only be in there for the first term because it didn't work out so well. So there's the tariff, and I compared it to Little Rock. Now I know most of you may not be aware of Little Rock, or weren't, but again, the use of military force, the use of troops is within the president's purview, okay, to quell insurrection and to enforce federal law. Okay. Now we do have a federal law enforcement agency, of course, today, but they didn't have one then. The FBI, they did then, but not in the time of talked about the removal. Keep in mind, all judicial decisions depend on someone's willingness to enforce it. You understand? Like, because the court has no, all the court has in terms of like force are marshals. And all marshals can really do is arrest people, right, and then deliver them to the court, right? Like that's their function, to carry prisoners and stuff like that. So if you're going to have a country, the Cherokee people, stopping the people of Georgia, you're going to probably have to have armed forces. And Jackson's like, no, thank you. I don't do that. So the Trail of Tears is the sort of common nickname for the Indian Removal Act, tragically. And here you see it. This painting, which I've used before, doesn't make it look like they are suffering. It looks like the Oregon Trail or something. That is not a fair representation. I don't want you to think that it was just this sort of comfy wagon ride out to Oklahoma. Not at all. They were freezing, they were starving. White people treated them openly hostile on the way. Boatmen wouldn't carry them across rivers. They wouldn't give them provisions or sell them. So it was a tough gig. All right. But today's the second major theme or topic for Jackson, and I want to pick up with this. Now, the charter of the bank had been vetoed by Madison initially, the Reed Charter. So remember, the initial Bank of the United States was created by Alexander Hamilton using the doctrine of implied powers, using the elastic clause as the authority. When it expired, it had a 20-year sort of expiration date. And when it expired, it was in the midst of the War of 1812, which meant it didn't exist for a while. That meant the federal government's money was now sort of like had to go somewhere else. And the bank had to be rechartered. So Madison ultimately signs it, showing that he is accepting or willing, I'll be looking at this Snell's DBQs, willing to be flexible on this issue. Not keen on it, but willing, able. And so Jackson is going to show, first of all, the world, or at least the country, that he's willing to use the veto for what he considers personally distasteful. And in this case, and you need to write this down because I don't think he made it in the textbook at all, but Jackson is going to be known as the greater user of the veto because he uses it more than any of his predecessors combined. You take the first 6 presidents and add up all their vetoes, Jackson goes more. Now, it's not that many, it's like 9 or something, but the point is like he wields the veto as a personal extension of his authority. So when Henry Clay pushes for a infrastructure bill, now John C. Calhoun had done this with the bonus bill, this is called the veto of the Maysville Road. What happens is Clay wants to use some federal monies in Kentucky to build a highway. Jackson vetoes it, but his reason for vetoing, you might have to explain it when you send it back to Congress, is not that it's unconstitutional. He doesn't like it. He thinks it's not within Clay's, he shouldn't spend the money on Kentucky at all, right? So he's going to veto this, and it sends a signal, by the way, that he is, if there's something he doesn't like, he's going to stop it. He's not going to just kind of passively accept it. He's going to stop it. So what has happened, and I ask you in your reading guide, and you should be aware of this, is why was the bus, the Bank of the United States, routinely targeted for Democratic criticism? Has anybody read that far? Why was the bus so Go ahead.
They said it was like a monopoly.
Okay. It was a monopoly, but I don't think that's, it is a fair criticism. A monopoly meaning the only place the government put its money. But what you need to write down about number 51 and be aware of it if you're using your study guide is that the bus was what we call a conservative lender. A conservative lender. What does that mean? What's a conservative lender? Okay, does anybody know what caused the great housing bubble that led to the recession of 07? All right, folks, the federal government's policy during the Clinton administration and to some degree the Bush administration was to try to encourage lending, so that credit would be expanded. And what would that credit be used to finance? Well, housing creation. Some folks bought houses on not very smart loans. They use what we're called adjustable rate mortgages, which means when interest is low, that's great, but when interest goes up, that means Your interest rates go up. That means the payments that you are paying are not affecting the principal. They're only like interest payments, and that's never a place you want to be. So a lot of low-income folks borrowed money with the government's encouragement. At the same time, a lot of other folks bought multiple houses. You understand? With the intention to flip them. Again, cheap credit, right? Well, that meant that the people they were borrowing money from was making risky lending practices. There's a beautiful movie made on this called The Big Short. All right, and in The Big Short, this one investor recognizes that the banks have over-leveraged themselves. They've actually loaned out too much money to risky returns. People aren't paying them back fast enough, and that means people are going to start doing what's called default, not pay back their loans. All right, so conservative banks, like I use BB&T, which is now called Truist, which I'm not happy to see because BB&T was a good, solidly conservative lending bank, regional. All right, the bigger they get, the less, because what do investors want? Quick returns. And so that means you got to get money out and get money in, and it's got to be quicker, right? Well, the bus was a conservative lender. It didn't loan money out like carelessly. It didn't expand credit easily. If you borrowed money from the bus, you were probably a really good credit rating. So like I got like a credit score of, you guys ever do credit scores? All right, so I've got like I don't even remember right now currently. I'm going to show you that way you can see what I'm talking about. But like a credit score, let's see where I can go to my credit score. Give me a second, everybody. Credit score thing. No, it's something, one of the things I don't have in front of me, but the last time I looked at it was like 830 or something, which is a pretty good number, apparently. And that means I'm always getting offers to borrow money. And really, really low. Now, right now, everybody's getting offers to borrow money. The bus only lended out to kind of like sure bets. Guess who ain't a sure bet? Well, what about Democrats made them not sure bets? They were frontiers. They were speculators. They were people going out west hoping to make it, right? And so the bus just didn't do that. It didn't lend its money to guys and like wandering out in the wilderness with the hope that they would create a homestead. So the bank was a very conservative lender, and people usually blame banks when they don't get money from them, right? And so if you wanted to borrow money, you were going to have to find some other source. Well, Democrat politicians said, well, we should make the other source. We should have these local and state banks. Remember, local and state, that sounds like Democrat, not federalist kind of stuff. And this big national bank is hoarding all the money. That's the monopoly phraseology. It's like holding on to all this wonderful capital that if they would just loan it out, it would unleash a flood of westward growth and new farms and all this wonderfulness. Keeping in mind that about 1 out of every 2 frontiersmen failed. You understand? So not like any means a safe bet. As far as like to make a farm and do all that, a lot of these guys end up selling the land with a debt attached to it, and they become sort of like tenant farmers, right? So it was not easy. Plus, it was privately run. This guy Biddle was not a government appointee. You understand? He was just like a rich New Yorker, and that meant Bostonian. I forget. He was rich, and he was from the north, which was another thing, like to target the bad guys. Now, I was hypercritical of the banks back in 2007. All right, but it wasn't because of their regional location or the fact that they weren't loaning money out. They were loaning money out so riskily that it brought down the entire bubble, right? It burst. And then our government bailed them out, which I thought was even worse. All right, but we had to do it. It's a choice between bad and worse. Well, these guys, Jackson's voters, and I really do think that Jackson is the first president who said, the people who brought me here are the people I'm most looking after. You understand? Like my voters or my constituents. Now, I have always believed that the President of the United States should be above constituency. He represents the America, like the good of the nation as a whole. Jackson thought this was bad for the nation, though, to have Czar Biddle, they called him, running this private enterprise with the federal government's money as the source of their money. But Jackson recognized this thing had been around for a while, and if you remember the guy who had been the Treasury Secretary. Does anybody remember Albert Gallatin, that name? Does that ring a bell? So that he had heard the arguments for the bus, and so he kind of accepted that it was there. Well, that brought in, here again is the other reason why I would say, the other issue is money itself. So today, if you're dealing with money, and you have a dollar bill, and you look at the top of it, it says Federal Reserve note. okay, which is a form of bank note. All money, unless it's Bitcoin or something like that, like bullion, is issued by a bank, be it the Medici Bank, the Fugger Bank in the Netherlands. Doesn't matter. The banks issue this currency, right? Our bank is issued by the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve. So this central bank did not make paper money. The bus did not make like paper money. What the bus made was hard money. So what's hard money? Well, that's coinage, gold and silver, or gold and silver certificates. You understand? So in other words, your money was backed up by specie. Specie. See, that might be the first time you ever heard that word used that way. Your money was backed up by bullion, gold and silver. Did that make it trustworthy? Yeah, people love, secure money. You mind like an ounce of gold a day is I don't know how expensive, right? So, is it? Okay. So the coinage had to be based on specie. And the banks that were at the state level frequently floated money backed by debt. What our money is now. Backed by debt obligations. So in other words, how much you put out to the society, well, that represented an amount of money that you had basically were expecting back, not that you already had on hand. See the difference? You're like, I'm giving you these certificates with interest. These certificates, when they get paid back, will earn me the actual real money. And that was much more useful for who? Speculators. And this is a huge period of speculation. Okay? That means people who are basically guessing on the hope that their investment will give them a bigger return. Here's the thing about most speculators. Most speculators don't want to pay the full bill. You buy a house for $250,000, you're looking to flip it, you don't really want to pay back $250,000. You're going to flip it, take the proceeds from your sales, pay off the original loan, and pocket the profit, right? So you're not buying land with the intent of actually living on it. You're buying land with the intention of selling it. That, again, is called speculation. That's what our stock market does. And when I buy the shares of stock in the stock market through like a mutual fund or something like that, I don't want to do that. I just want it to continually, slowly grow over time at a faster rate of return than, say, a banking account would do. But for a lot of ordinary investors, day traders, not people with pension funds, they want to maximize their return as quick as possible. That's what? Speculation. Okay? So the southern and western types want easy money, cheap money, available money. Okay? The New England and New York types are, well, here's the problem with this. This gets you a good return, right? This is confidence money. This is risky money, and so they don't want risky money. So what happens is it's 1832. Now, if you remember yesterday, we were talking about the election of 28, right? So the year is 1832. You've had a new group emerge who are sort of going to be opposed to Andrew Jackson. They're going to be called the Whigs. Their primary two leaders are Senator Daniel Webster and Senator Henry Clay. Remember Clay and Webster? They're going to be in this new coalition. And they believe they can charter the bank early. This proves to be a terrible mistake. If you want to know a lesson of history, don't bluff Andrew Jackson. All right. So what I mean by that is the bus is not set to expire until 1836. It was renewed by Madison in 1860, which means for 20 years, it means in 1836, then through normal proceedings, we'll vote to either keep it or not. They want to force it early. Why? They didn't learn with John Quincy Adams. They think Jackson will veto it and wreck the economy. Well, that would be a bad idea, right? So then he'll have to what? And alienate some of his supporters who hate the bus. So they're trying to trap him. Like either veto this thing, it'll kill America, or you assign this thing, it'll kill your chances with your own people. They think that's smart. Not smart. So what happens to the charter? Jackson vetoes it. No, it doesn't expire. He kills it 4 years early. All right. He vetoes it. You're like, okay, I'll veto it, and then I'll take all the money from the government and I'll put them in state banks, regional banks at the state level. These will become nicknamed his pet banks, like banks that are his. They're not literally his, but they're his Western supporters and stuff. So he's taking the money out of the bus. Why would he do that? He vetoes it, but it's not, that's an extension. The bus still gets to live till 36, right? So he's vetoed the renewal of it, but the bus is still alive. But then he got, and this is why it's called the bank war. Then what does Jackson do? Takes the money out of the bus that's in there. Who's the number one depositor in the Bank of the United States? The United States, right? The federal government. They're the depositor. He takes the deposits out and puts them in these state banks. What do they immediately proceed to do? Loan them out. Cheap interest rates. Speculative bubble, right? Exactly what the Whigs were afraid would happen. All right. Meanwhile, the bank does everything in its possibility to try to get money to stay alive. What does a bank do when it's had a run on its bank?
Try to get its money.
How do you do that? How do you get its money?
No.
No. Now, you could do that, but the problem is that their lenders are reasonable people, and they're not going to borrow money at crazy interest rates. In other words, they're not going to have their own rates increased. They're going to recall their loans from other people. So in other words, like I think I have 14 months left on my mortgage. So if the bank tomorrow said we want 10 or 18 grand or whatever it is left, I could pay that. I don't want to pay that. I'd rather just pay the 14 months, right? Well, if you have $100,000 on your house and you are recalled, now you're going to go out here and find 100 grand, right? So that meant the bank starts pulling money in. It also starts pulling in because what are the people? Its creditors want their money. It's a run on the bank. You know that expression? The people who put their money in the bank also want it out, or are afraid they'll lose it. So the bank starts foreclosing and calling in. So guess where that hurts? The frontier, right? You know, the people on the frontier. Now, the charter will expire and the bank will go bankrupt. But I want you to see this. This is Jackson's reasoning for vetoing. Now, I would argue that Jackson is by no means an economist, but he's got a decent guy advising him named Martin Van Buren. All right? It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful bend government for selfish reasons. Distinctions will always exist. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws take to add natural and just advantages, artificial distinctions. So in other words, the bus is being used to make rich people richer, but the ordinary working class people, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, have a right to complain about it. No necessary evils in government. If it confine itself to equal protection, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide departure from these principles. He's vetoing the bus because he says it better suits who? Rich people. Well, it did better suit rich people. What's the problem with poor people?
They aren't going to pay.
Right, they're risky loans. Like banks aren't set up for charity. Banks don't loan money out to people normally unless the government tells them to and gives them assistance. Banks don't just like, here, your terrible credit, have money. You know, that's not how banks operate. Now, risky banks do that. That's why we have these payday lending companies, these check cashing companies, because poor people can't borrow money. They don't have any cash. They don't have any capital. They don't have any credit rating. So he's saying the bus creates an unfair, well, guys, this just in. People who invest are going to be richer, right? Historically. So, but he's vetoing it, not because it's unconstitutional or not. He's vetoing it because he thinks it plays unfair games. It's helping who? It's helping the rich. Now he argues at the unfairly to the poor. But I never think much about Jackson being a class warrior, y'all. I mean, like Marx, right? But that's basically what he's saying is that the bus benefits rich people and poor people are screwed because of it, or treated badly because of it. I would argue the bus doesn't have much of a role with poor people. Are you guys upset about the price of flying subsonic jets anymore across transatlantic flights?
Yes.
That driving you nuts, you know, that you can't fly on the Concorde anymore? The only people that ever fly on the Concorde are rich people. It's not like I think it affects normal people. But what these people have heard from their political leaders is the reason you can't borrow money is who? The bank. This big bank. You'll be able to borrow money if we put it where? And they were. They were able to. And then guess what? What happens when a lot of people are borrowing?
More and more money goes in circulation.
Could be. But that's not the issue as much. That's an inflation question. People speculate. speculative. And so the money that goes out of the bus, which was like not speculative money, was money put in sound businesses, money put in, like pretty good returns. This is why we invest in federal government bonds. When you buy government bonds, why do you expect to get a return? Yeah, it's the government. I mean, they got not pay their debt, not possible. But the point is that we expect the greater confidence, the less return. That makes sense? Because it's not risky. The risk comes, that's where the big variables come. So this is what happens. The bank crashes. By the way, there's Jackson depicted in the cartoons of 32. Love this cartoon. You see what's going on here? Can you see what he's standing shredded on? The Constitution, born to command. He's wielding the royal veto. You mind kings have veto, right? Scepter like a king. King Andrew I. So his critics named their new party the what? The Whigs, the anti-king party. Sorry, I didn't see this post. Yeah, I see what you wrote. So yeah, you guys understand this? Now, is this fair? What does Jackson believe he's doing the whole time? Helping the common man, the people, his people, right? And he had been brewing for this fight for a while. I mean, this guy particularly, and I should point this out politically, this guy gave money to help get his rivals elected. The Biddle wasn't just like a neutral player, you understand? But Gallatin from Switzerland, yeah, that's where it's from, Switzerland. These guys, they're realizing that the banks do play favorites. Now, it's your job as a student to recognize Jackson and his constituents, his voters. You also got to think from the bank perspective. Is it the bank's duty or responsibility to be an engine of capitalism at this point or not? Is that how it's perceived? And think also about the future of our country, because we don't have a private bank anymore managing the nation's money. We're going to have something completely different. And every major developed country has a central bank. What Hamilton created. But at the same time, what is the role of the central bank? When we get to the Federal Reserve, that's really when we'll take that topic up again. So this is called the Bank War. It's the third major part of President Jackson's presidency. Okay, but if you go back, the beginning part that we were talking about, Jackson's earliest issue is called the tariff conflict, the tariff dispute, and Jackson handles it how? Was Jackson's response to the threat of nullification and even potentially secession? Yeah. Well, he doesn't actually deploy. Let me be fair. He doesn't send troops into South Carolina. He is authorized to do that in South Carolina back then. So they know. Calhoun certainly knows who is not bluffed. Jackson. Congress gives me the authority. He would probably take it anyway, knowing Jackson. So this major issue, right? Native American issue, and now this thing. Now, not the bus. Now, none of those things jump off the page as being, well, maybe Indian, as being like a terrible event or a big event. But in the long term, it's the beginning of a change in how the presidency works. Prior to this, we chose people who would be sort of a almost above the fray, like neutral figures. But with the era of Jacksonian democracy, we're now selecting people who we think are our guy. You see the difference? Not the nation's neutral protector, but us. Like, this is our dude, And let's talk about the impact of that in a second. But first, I want to give you something else that's not in the book that you should know, write down or be familiar with. Don't think it's in this book. And that is, during Jackson's presidency, a Frenchman came to our country. So this might remind you of another Frenchman who was here who wrote about America. Some of the best ways to observe a nation is from a neutral third party. You understand, like a guest. A guest is going to be like writing about us as an observer, almost like if you went to the zoo or something, And this fellow's name is Alexis de Tocqueville. And his 4-volume set, Democracy in America, is a landmark collection. Like, in other words, it is constantly referenced and looked at by historians. And it was published during Jackson's presidency. You can see it was 4 parts, 35 to 40. And it is, in many ways, the first step that a lot of Americans have at this point in history to understanding America. You know, it's like there's no history classes, unless you're at Harvard, maybe. You know, so if you wanted to learn what America, because this guy, de Tocqueville, travels throughout America. And he makes all these observations about what life in our country is like. And if you look up here, it's pretty interesting. Instruct democracy to reanimate its beliefs, to purify, to regulate its movements, to substitute little by little the science of affairs for its inexperience. So in other words, what is going to evolve in America? Government, our political relationship. And by writing a series called Democracy in America, is he observing how democracy is becoming more common? He's seeing it firsthand and comparing it. Keep in mind, you know, France during this period is under Napoleon III, or soon will be. All right, you know, they're not democratic really, you know, at that point. But he's saying, you know, study, and it's interesting to me. It's like keep actively pursuing. And I think about America today when we have debates about civil rights in the 21st century. That is exactly what de Tocqueville is talking about. When you see debates about gay marriage, or debates about justice for minorities, or, you know, help for the working poor and jobs and things like that. All of these are debates that were not real in the 1820s. So we have continuously evolved. You know, we're debating right now the constitutionality of a national semi-healthcare system, not a part of 1825 America. So always invigorating itself, always reconsidering, you know. But he also writes about, guess who? Women. Women in America, he says, are definitely not equal to men. They are in a position of what? Extreme dependence. However, I have never seen women anywhere else treated as like an important position as in America. This is what we were going to call, or will learn to call, Republican motherhood. Yeah, cult domesticity. The growing strength of the people, mainly I should reply to the superiority of American women. So, as he said, look, women are not equal to men. They're totally dependent on men. But they are sure treated better here than they are, say, in Europe. So I point that out to recognize that even de Tocqueville is aware that women are not politically equal. But it's during this period that you're going to start to have women actively saying, why don't we have better rights? Why aren't we treated better? And you'll have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton emerge 8 years after that book. Not because of this, you know, but they're going to be famous by 1848. So I don't want you to forget where we are in this Jacksonian narrative, how closely these events are connected, like almost side by side. Okay? So we have an election, and Jackson is going to run against the Federalists, in essence. Now, they're not called Federalists. They're called what? What do we say they were going to be called?
National Republic.
National Republic. They're basically the same group. And they're going to be called Whigs in 36. So there is a line of experience between them. But if you see here, this will be the first time that who steps on these stages, the presidential candidate. Clay, we're going to do it 2 more times, 3 times total. All right, national presidential candidate. And you can see he gets slammed. Right? Did the strategy by the future Whigs of putting the bus up on the ballot help? Did nationalizing the bank as a topic succeed? Did Jackson give them what they wanted? No. He vetoed it. Which is what they thought he wouldn't do. And you can see Clay wins his own state, a handful of others. You will see for the first time in a national election a third party. So I want you to know the anti-Masons party. They literally were a party against secret societies. Anti-Mason, like the Masons. You guys familiar with Masons? You've heard of them? The symbols. So Washington had been a Mason. Jackson was a Mason. There's this accusation that these folks are like meeting in secret rooms with handshakes, you know, plotting the world. Has been with them all along. Anti-Masons don't do very well, although they get some actual, you know, rarity electoral votes. But they invent a new way of selection. They're the first to use what? I have this in the reading. All right, so they're going to invent the nominating convention that will now be copied by all the parties. You understand the convention? All right, so I would be aware of that too. All right, now it's during Jackson's second term that those pet banks speed up speculation. Those pet banks start doing what with they're nicely now presented with federal dollars. So what are they going to do with these? Keep in mind, it's gold backs. They're like real money. What do we get to do with it? They shower it on the public, like here, borrow money. But then they do what all speculators do. They get, in the words of one very famous conservative Federal chairman, Alan Greenspan, he said, they were overcome by irrational exuberance. That's Fed speak for they got carried away. Irrational exuberance, right? So what happens is they loan out too much money. They become wildcat lenders. So they're called wildcat banks. That means they basically loan money with no money down. They loan money to people who have no stream of income, no credit to speak of. And I read in some case, maybe in this book, guys who like carry money in suitcases to the frontier and just loan money out with like IOUs. So there's just money pouring everywhere. So what does that do when money's pouring out everywhere? It fuels what? What word? Speculation. If you can get money easily and cheaply, then you'll risk it. Most people don't want to speculate something they had to work 40 hours for. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what you eat with. But it's like gambling. I have a number one rule for gambling. If I'm going to do it, it's only with money I'm willing to lose. And I usually am not willing to lose any money. So guess what? I don't do much gambling. Not to say that other people can or can't. I feel like I work too hard for money. The last thing I want to do is throw it down a hole. But these guys expect, and again, this goes back to the 07, the recession. They were lending money to, you should watch some movies I've seen. Like the money they were lending out to people with no credit rating, with negative credit rating, basically. Like, and you're thinking, what on earth are these people thinking? Right? But keep in mind, in 07, the big banks were buying debt instruments. They were buying up IOUs and packaging them, selling them as equities. They were selling them on the stock market. So that meant people didn't realize they were buying bad debt. This period, they did know they were buying bad or selling. So Jackson's like, well, we can't have the federal government's land purchased in fake money. You understand? It's got to be paid with what? Well, what's real money in 1836? It's got to be gold and silver backed. Now, here's your super irony: is this massive bubble fueled by Jackson's policies, right? And when he looks at it, and Van Buren looks at it, they're like, that's getting bad. It's a bubble, and they're like, you got to pay in hard cash. Boop! The bubble just explodes. Because what are a lot of these wildcat banks loaning out now? Fake money, right? They're loaning out their banknotes, not just U.S. dollar banknotes. You understand the difference? Like they're just lumping good money with bad and loaning it all out. Well, that means the speculation just crashes to a halt. But the problem when you do that is it creates a what? Jackson was trying to create a soft landing. Unfortunately, word got out pretty quick and it didn't create a soft landing. In other words, he was trying to contract the monetary supply. Go back to your talk about the increase in money, right? The problem is the president is not the person you want to see contracting the monetary supply. Too heavy-handed. It needs to be more subtle. How do we contract monetary supply now? There's three ways. You guys follow the Federal Reserve stuff? Yeah, one of them is to adjust interest rates. If you want to bring money back into the central bank, you raise interest rates. Harder to borrow. You increase the reserves. You require the banks to have more on hand, right? Like you got to keep 30% on hand as opposed to 5 or something like that, right? Third, who basically prints money? Federal Reserve extends the amount of money in circulation that's happened in our society, quantitative easing. So if you want to retract that, then what do? You stop expanding monetary supply, right? You just stop printing it. So that means money becomes more scarce. Okay? So when money becomes more scarce, i.e. this, hopefully people will stop what? Stop spending, stop borrowing, right? Unfortunately, it collapses. And we have the second economic crisis in American history. And this one is worse. So it's called the Panic of 1837, okay? You should be familiar with what happens when a panic happens. Keep in mind, I'll go ahead and show you this now. I'll show it earlier. I'll show it again. A panic is an acute, this is an economic definition. I got it out of the economics book. An acute financial disturbance. So a panic leads to a what? What is a panic really another word for? or depression. I've always heard a recession is when I'm out of work for a period of time, right? Me to you. The depression is when you're out of work. That's how you feel, right? The point is like sustained months of recession equals depression, okay? And it's the same. So I want y'all to understand, every time you hear that word panic, it's depression or recession. So we always think about the Great Depression. The only reason that one gets so much more attention is because it was the first really, really global one. We had numerous recessions or depressions that were just as bad economically to America as the Great Depression. But this one was global, so it's just like the pandemic. If the virus were just in, I don't know, China, we wouldn't be thinking that much about it, right? Yeah, so yeah, right. Take her back. So I put this up here. So banknotes lose their value. You understand? They're not worth anything. Banknotes are money. Keep in mind, there is no central currency. There is no national currency. You understand? Land sales. Obviously, people stop speculating in it, which means if you can't borrow money to buy land, the guy who was going to sell it to you had borrowed money to buy land. What do they now do? They can't pay for it. And so the bank has to do what banks never want to do, and that's foreclose. Why does a bank not really want to foreclose on your house? Bank can't live in your house. You understand? The bank doesn't want a house. That means you got to pay property taxes. You know, the bank wants the house with somebody else paying them, right? So there are going to be foreclosures for the first time on a large scale. No more credit. And this affects even rich people. Unemployment shoots through the roof. So did Jackson mess up here?
Yeah.
Keep in mind, though, this is laissez-faire democracy, meaning under capitalist rules, who's not really thinking of trying to control the economy at all? The government. So he would say, you guys, get up. You can't sit here and get down, period. You guys familiar with the Latin phrase, let the buyer beware? Have you ever heard of it? Caveat emptor. Caveat venditor, number one. Let the seller beware. So in other words, Jackson is looking out, he believes, for who in this issue? Who's Jackson helping, taking care of? No, the nation. The nation, right? Like that's his focus now. We can't have the nation, having all this crappy money. Jackson, it's too heavy-handed. It's like a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. Dig? And what it does is it bursts so quickly. Now, what I like to show people, because I always hear students talk about this, and I'm like, you don't understand. People will take a snapshot of any president at any moment in history and say how great they are, if it suits their interest. So I pulled two partisan posts off the web from like biased groups. Okay, so if you go back to Obama's administration, when he takes office, Dow Jones 10,000 points less, unemployment 2 whole percentage points less. You got it. So in this column, Obama's awesome. Then over here, you've got a comparison of Trump. Wait a minute, I thought unemployment was 5.8. See, it's at any moment, if you take a snapshot of one president at a moment, and a snapshot of another president at a moment, you can make either one of them look good or bad. You're going to have that all your life, so get used to it. And then I'm going to tell you one thing. Presidents have almost no control over the economy. Because we're capitalists. Now, yes, we're more mixed than we've ever been, but we're still a capitalist society. So what Jackson did is not something presidents can really do today. They can't just burst the monetary supply, because we now have what's called an independent Fed Reserve. So the best thing presidents can do, it's one of the things I give both these guys credit for, is appoint smart Fed chairmen, appoint smart Fed Reserve presidents, banks. So in other words, you want the people in charge of the nation's monetary supply to not get hung up on that whole D&R thing. You want them to care about the fiscal security of America, right? So sure, I would love to be able to, keep in mind, if President Obama or President Trump created the New Deal, you might point at some sort of job creation. 30% of the entire nation's GDP is government created. 30%. So of course there are going to be some connections. If you give a government job to somebody, they have a job. You understand? But this is all BS. All right? So there's Jackson. He kind of meanders off into obscurity. He has a talking parrot who really only knows his curse words. When Jackson dies, he doesn't go to obscurity. He's a hero. People love it. In fact, the panic doesn't fully break until after the election of 1836. In other words, it doesn't actually happen in Jackson. It's all the way. And this will become a consistent tradition of economic crises occurring for the next giant cleanup, right? Of course, that means who gets easily elected. Oh, here's Jackson right before his death. Eric was cursing when he died. They say. So he picks his treasurer and secretary and vice president, Martin Van Buren. Now, Martin Van Buren is no Andrew Jackson. Let's make that clear. Okay. Martin Van Buren is a smart guy. He's a New Yorker, but not a general. Okay. And he's a banker type. So he's much more like a Hamiltonian on paper, although he is a Democrat. He is more of a small government advocate. We think, we being people who actually study this, think that the word okay moves into the American lexicon because of Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was from Kinderhook, New York. And so he was called Old Kinderhook. And a lot of people, they want to spell Kinderhook, so they would write, he's okay. And that would become a thing. Like, because have you ever wondered, like, why do we use okay? That's a weird choice of letters. So it seems to be because of Martin Van Buren. So the Whigs have a strategy to beat him. It seems like a good strategy on paper. The Whigs are they're going to fully adopt that party name, Whig, in this election. The Whigs believe that they can't beat the Democrats in a straight up one-for-one campaign. Jackson's too popular. We call Van Buren a coattails politician, meaning he's able to ride in on Jackson's support. But they believe if each region of the country, they run a Whig, that thus the favorite son, each region's favorite son, then there will be no majority in the Electoral College. What happens when there's no majority in the Electoral College?
It goes to the
It goes to the House, where they have Henry Clay's leadership, right? Daniel Webster's leadership. So they'll end up selecting a Whig in the House. So they're kind of going back to that 1824 model. It doesn't work. Van Buren comfortably wins the electoral vote. You understand? He wins a strong showing in the South, as well as in his home state of New York. Got some new states out here. So he does fine. You know, what has not happened yet? The collapse. But almost like the weeks of him taking office, he helped do the specie circular with Jackson. That happened. The numbers, for those of you looking at home and can see the details, are numbers of bank failures. So that's where the Panic of 1837 went. Didn't help that a bank in England failed too. So this is not a global economy, but we are sort of connected to the European economy to some degree. But this panic was brought on by intense over-speculation, particularly where? Southwestern lands, particularly this area right here, this part, by these wildcat banks. Now, Van Buren has no solution for this. He will become known to his critics, and that is many Americans, as Martin Van Ruin. Like, you ruined us, right? The almost identical thing happens to Herbert Hoover. You go to 1929, stock market crash, that's in the first couple months of his presidency, or 6 months of his presidency. You understand? So a lot of times presidents are blamed for things that happen once they're, I mean, you cannot blame George W. Bush reasonably for 9/11. I mean, there were some critics who said he could have done more to be prepared for the potential act of terror, but we had no specific details on the attack on the World Trade Center, right? So, and again, you know, that's in September of the year he took office, so not that far into it. But yeah, these presidents are going to inherit a rough road. And look at what he says. This is really fascinating. Keep in mind, his people, the American people, the common man, are the ones struggling with it a lot. This is one of those depressions that hurts everybody, not just rich people. Okay? Framers of our Constitution judge the less government interferes with private pursuits, the better. So here you hear both a Democrat and earlier somebody like, you know, a Federalist even, saying we should leave the economy alone. The less interference, the better. So if you ever wonder, like, when did America become capitalist? It's after this panic that it really begins to happen fully. The market revolution, capitalism, full flourish. But it was like it before. And so presidents of this day had no solution. There's no weapon in their arsenal to deal with a nationwide economic crisis, right? And that's, again, today we have the means to deal with it. Just like we have the means to respond to a pandemic. You know, we're in a different place in 1837. Okay? The difficulties and distress of the time, though great, are limited. It cannot be regarded as affecting the permanent prosperity. So here, Van Buren would take a page out of many, many small government laissez-faire leaders. What will have to happen is we'll have to write it out. We'll just have to suck it up, you know. And so that becomes, and here's an interesting argument he makes. A great degree of the problems are with foreign and domestic commerce. Who's feeling it the worst? Commercial and banking interests. By and large, the great agricultural interest, that's slave ownership, primarily. Do these periodic economic panics set back slavery? No. In other words, ironically, of all the ironies, is that while the North is getting much, much richer overall per capita throughout this period, the South is staying rich, consistently doing the same thing. The South, rich people. Keep in mind, I compare the South often to like Saudi Arabia. Your ordinary people in the South are in desperate poverty almost. But that's normal for them. They're always there. They're yeoman farmers who are frontiersmen and struggling, and that's life. So they're not the speculators. These city banker types are the speculators, right? And the land investors. So he's not going to help, says that. And by the way, if you're a wealthy landowner in the South who owns slaves, you're almost in like a singular experience. Like you have your own little microcosm there. So yes, they got hurt some. Cotton production goes down during this period. But if you're producing tobacco or rice, no big deal. The proceeds of our great staples will furnish the means of fixing the debts at home and abroad. So he's saying the agricultural staple, by the way, S-T-A-P-L-E, in this is not like a stapler. It's like food, staple crop. So the proceeds of our great foods will furnish the means of fixing our debts at home and abroad. So in other words, what's going to happen, Van Buren says, is the farm produce is going to be sold to foreigners, and they're going to buy it, and that's going to help fix the problem. It doesn't for a while. In the end, though, America will recover about 3 years later, 2.5 years later. Like it's one of those things where. So I want to show you and close with this sort of like the economic characteristic of American history. Thank goodness it's better now. For a long time, it was terrible. So this is the term, but this is what and again, most of you probably had this in like personal finance or marketing, small business or something. But a capitalist economy tends to work this way. Europe and us. They're a little bit less capitalist than we are, but they still have capitalism. So another way to look at it is these highs and lows. You see them here? So you have a peak, which is at the height of investment. So if you're coming over here, you have growth rises. It's overheating, increasing inflation. The bank brings in money. Growth slows. Capacity is then has to be sold off. That means inflation is less, and then the bank allows money to go back out. So it's almost like a heart beating. This is the invisible hand of the market, kind of adjusting. We call this the peak and the trough. So your recession, right around here is where your whatever triggering event will be. The stock market crash of October 29, or the specie circular of 1836, and that will lead to sort of a fall off, a recession. And it's during this period how long this lasts, whether or not you have a depression, if it continues on, and then you have slowly recovery. So what happens is we get carried away, we overcreate, we overproduce, we overcreate, businesses, and then some of them fail. And then we burn off all the excess. This is called, by the way, creative destruction in capitalism. Creative destruction, like the jobs have to be destroyed, but hey, So this happened a lot when I was a kid. The internet was born. So when the internet was born, in the 1990s, there were massive numbers of .coms. DOT coms is how they describe it, .com. By the end of the 90s, there were massive numbers of not coms. Like companies that just gone out of business. They never made a profit. They never did anything successful. That's the nature of the capitalist cycle. But again, I want to take you back to what may be more important, and you can see it here in this blue line. The hope of the American capitalist society is this blue line. If you see it down here, these are wages. You see through all these red and blue presidents? It has ups and downs. You see that? But what is the long-term trend? Up. That's hopeful. The beauty of, by the way, this is the economy from the Great Depression to 2008. All right, the Bush recession. So the deeper down it is, the longer the depression. But you'll notice they're often offset by higher peaks, right? So peaks and valleys, and and again, here you have, here's President Reagan, the yellow line. This is as far as payroll jobs, like private sector, normal people jobs, not government. Here you have President Clinton, light blue. You have President Obama, right? So almost all these presidents, you'll see over time a steady job growth rate. Now, sometimes though, recession, that's right when Bush left office. Well, that had a huge impact on his election. Between Hurricane Katrina, the war in Iraq, and the recession, President Bush was very unpopular. But if it had been 5 months later, right, he would not have been as unpopular. So President Obama inherits see how this is Obama right here. You see this line going down? That's Bush. See how it goes down? And it goes up. So when we talk about the Trump recovery, well, it started under the Obama recovery. And at some point, it's due to go up. Now, this is how it works. Now, the hope is, what will not be as deep? The recession, and not as long. So what you would like to see is a whole lot more of just this blue line and a lot less of the rise and falls. But because we don't have a managed economy, who manages our economy? Free market. Yes, 30% of GDP is government created, but that means like the company Babcock and Wilcox up the road in Lynchburg makes nuclear submarine parts. So you work for a private company whose contract is with who? My cousin works for Booz Allen Hamilton in Maryland. Booz Allen's a private company, but their only contract is with who? The U.S. government. So a lot of our economy in our country is now paid for by taxpayer dollars. That was not the case in 1837. Okay, there were very few federal jobs. Okay, so lots of these rise and valleys, right, peaks and troughs. And the overall goal, though, hopefully, is that the recovery will lead to greater growth. So even though you have a trough, the trough might still be in a growing direction, if that makes sense. And that's, as long as that continues to grow, you have reason to be optimistic. And I am optimistic about it because that's capitalism. It's the nature of capitalism. So we're going to learn about in our course, there are times when capitalism is manipulated with something. And to this day, you have libertarians who are utter free market capitalists. They believe that there shouldn't be any government regulations. You have moderate Democrats like Bill Clinton who cut regulations on some businesses and cut taxes. You have super pro-business Republicans. I think President Trump has certainly been one. And then you have like far left people who want greater control over the economy. People like Bernie Sanders. So you have, within America, it's called the Overton window, which is the acceptable realm of debate, like the window of debate. So we can debate from democratic socialism as a radical position to free market libertarian capitalism as the other position, but you don't really hear people arguing for Marxism. So if you want to insult somebody, you call them a Marxist, but nobody's like seriously Marxist in America at a national. In Marx meaning the entire country is owned by the government. So anyway, no way to deal with the panic. As far as Van Buren thinks, and he's just going to let it ride out. And that's going to lead to our first non-Democrat getting elected in 1840. But before we do that, tomorrow we have to, or maybe Thursday, maybe tomorrow, we'll have to win Texas its independence. Okay? All that's happening at the same time.